Hey everybody, so this is my longer explanation to the cortisol video that I posted on Instagram. So I want to give you all the background information that I found because, I think you should be skeptical of things you see on the internet, and if it's not backed up, then I 100% support you not listening to those hooligans. So I don't want to be one of those hooligans. I know there's some of you out there who know me, you know my credentials, you've followed me for a while, you know I'm worth my salt. So I have some rapport with you, but there's some of you who I don't. So let it just be known. Let me set your expectations for this video. I have no desire to be YouTube famous, so I am not putting any time into editing this. I just really enjoy teaching and sharing information. So that is the priority here. So, okay, cortisol. Cortisol is a stress hormone. It is a major steroid hormone and is released from the adrenal gland. So its primary functions are to maintain adequate serum glucose levels while you're in a fasted state, and it does this by breaking things down and turning them into glucose. So glycogen is your go-to form of glucose. It's your storage form, but in the absence of glycogen, or maybe glycogen breakdown can't keep up with the need, then we have to go find glucose elsewhere. So we can get glucose from certain amino acids. We can turn them into glucose-like things called gluconeogenesis, literally meaning glucose, new, creating, gluconeogenesis. Okay, think like Genesis, the book of the Bible. And we can take them from triglycerides. So triglycerides are fatty acids. They come from your adipose or fat tissues. We break it down, triacylglycerols, or triglycerides. You have a glycerol backbone and 3 lipid fatty acids. It's been a minute. But anyways, you're taking that glycerol backbone and you're using that for glucose. So who is the primary beneficiary of this? Mainly your brain. So in periods of stress, your brain is thinking, what do I do? So in the literature, or at least the study I pulled up, or the article that I pulled up, the example was responding to a lion attacking you or the IRS auditing you. Both very stressful events, right? So one is going to have more of a physical response that, I might need to run away, fight for my life. So true fight or flight. The other one is more perceived fight or flight. In both scenarios, your brain needs that glucose. In one of those scenarios, your muscles are going to need that energy to get away. Okay, so that's a whole nother video. We're not going to talk about perceived and the whole stress response. We're just going to focus on cortisol. So what cortisol does is it does increase blood pressure. It does suppress the immune system. It increases blood sugar. There may be some research out there that relates cortisol levels to personality traits. I did not dive into that. I just wanted to mention that because I thought it was super interesting. I did a quick read of it, but not enough to really explain it to you. What I did find interesting though is we tend to think that cortisol will be elevated in anxiety disorders, but that research hasn't been super consistent, but what has actually been kind of consistent is PTSD, low cortisol levels in PTSD. I don't understand the meaning of that. I just thought that was a really interesting finding as someone who throughout my career, PTSD, clearly I work with military, but even before my military career, I worked on a PTSD inpatient ward. And so the intersection of biology and PTSD is extremely interesting to me. So anyways, just throw that out there. I don't have anything else on that to report. But one reason, oh no, I lost my light. One reason people get concerned about cortisol, bummer, I'm not gonna look as good on screen. So where this concern comes from, there's a couple different things. So first of all, what happens when cortisol goes wrong? And we call that Cushing syndrome. So that means you have chronically elevated cortisol levels, okay? And what happens is you have an increased risk of many health conditions. So heart attack and stroke, blood clots, infections. So your immune system is depressed. Cortisol will suppress the immune system, so your immune system's not responding. because cortisol causes things to break down so that they're more available through your body, well, now you have higher blood sugar, you have free-floating free fatty acids, your cholesterol is likely elevated, which can lead to all these, heart attack, stroke, your blood pressure is higher, you might experience depression, memory loss, insulin resistance, prediabetes, diabetes. Okay, so Cushing's syndrome and cortisol, I think people are looking at that and thinking, ooh, I don't want cortisol to be high. However, the level of cortisol in someone with Cushing's syndrome versus the level of cortisol that you can achieve from high intensity exercise, even prolonged high intensity exercise, not even close to each other. Okay, you're not going to reach the levels of someone with Cushing's syndrome. The other thing to know is someone with Cushing's syndrome, their cortisol remains elevated. There is no time off. So when that hormone is not exerting its effects, other things are happening. So for the normal person without Cushing's, yeah, cortisol might be high and it might be doing the same things because that's what cortisol is going to do its cortisol thing. But then it comes down and other hormones can exert their effects. Okay, so in the normal person, your cortisol is most elevated when you first wake up in the morning and then it tapers off throughout the day. For someone who's exercising, you might experience a spike during and shortly after exercise, but then your body compensates with suppression at night. Okay, so you have time off. So you have things that are happening in response to cortisol, and then you have things that are happening when cortisol is not exerting its effects. Versus Cushing's, cortisol is always exerting its effects. Okay, so that's number one. Let's see, we talked about levels during the day. We talked about that. Something that I found really interesting was the effect of cortisol, vitamin D, and testosterone. Ultimately, the study took 88 well-trained male athletes, and they tested jump height, jump power, and maximal joint torque measure, and found that vitamin D and cortisol had no impact on performance, nor did testosterone, as long as testosterone was in the reference range for testosterone. And so I've actually found that before I found some of this other stuff that I'm going to tell you about. But I found that extra interesting when I learned the history of where this misunderstanding about cortisol might have come from. And it does come from sport and performance research. There were some researchers who were using cortisol and free testosterone ratio to better understand overreaching versus overtraining. I'm not going to go into detail on the difference between those two things, but it is an important thing to understand if you're reading actual research. But essentially, we want to push an athlete the most we can without overtraining them. Because if we overtrain them, then that athlete needs to take time off and we're losing valuable time for their event, what have you. So we want to be able to push an athlete as far as we can without pushing them over the edge, because then we're getting the most adaptation, we're getting the most from them, we're getting them the most fit for that season, for that event, for that deployment, whatever it may be. Time is of the essence, right? So for some reason, that research became misinterpreted over time so that it started off as cortisol to free testosterone ratio, and at some point that got misunderstood, and in the research you start seeing cortisol and total testosterone. Now, the original thought was if you see a 30% decrease in that ratio, then you might be overtraining your athlete or you might be overreaching. Don't quote me on which one it is. For the purposes of this, it doesn't matter. The most important message to take from this is that some things were misinterpreted. So, so you had that, but then again, so the misunderstanding of free testosterone versus total testosterone, and then the misunderstanding of overreaching versus overtraining, and understanding where is that excessive stress level is really what we're trying to understand. So that's where some of these numbers might come from, and that might be causing misunderstandings. So in response to exercise, things that are below threshold, so 50, 60% of your VO2 max, not going to increase cortisol. In fact, you might experience a decrease in your cortisol with, that slow, low intensity stuff, okay? at that low intensity, so my distance runners, my distance cyclists, let's say you're doing zone 2 work. You do prolonged zone 2 work. It didn't give me a number or, a time of what's considered prolonged, but your distance work, you might still experience an increase in cortisol. But it's going to be a slow increase, okay? And it's going to be directly related to the duration of time that you're doing that work. Now, when you get over that 50-60% VO2 max, and you start reaching more threshold level, that's when we start to see increases in cortisol. It's going to be directly related to the intensity. So moderate intensity will have a lower increase compared to high intensity, but the duration also plays a role. So you can imagine somebody working moderate intensity for 15 minutes is going to have a lower response than somebody working moderate intensity for an hour, okay? As you become more fit, that threshold at where you start to see your cortisol tick up moves up. So it takes higher intensity for your cortisol to increase. And your increase over time is more blunted. It's not such a spike, okay? So you adapt. That's part of the point of cortisol, is it does cause some of that adaptation, okay? So some things to know is things that can also impact cortisol levels in response to exercise is your diet can impact it. Temperatures, so extreme hot, extreme cold can impact it. Again, the more trained you are, the more blunted it'll be. And there was something else on there that I thought that I needed to mention, and it's probably on another slide and I'll mention it later. But cortisol acts to restore homeostasis to the body. So you're exposed to a stressor. That stressor might be imagined or physical. So imagine being the IRS, physical being exercise, and it does promote catabolic processes. Okay, catabolic meaning breaking things down. I think this is where a lot of the concern about cortisol and athletes or people trying to lose weight and manage their weight comes from, is because cortisol causes things to break down. It causes your blood sugar to go up. It causes your muscles to be broken down. And it does have an anti-anabolic. So catabolic is break things down, anabolic is build things up. So cortisol increases the breaking down of things, decreases the building up of things. But these are actually, believe it or not, critical to protein synthesis. Protein synthesis being the building up of proteins, okay? So when we talk muscle, we talk an equation between protein breakdown and protein synthesis. Both are occurring in your body at all times, okay? If protein synthesis outpaces protein breakdown, you get muscle gain. If protein breakdown outpaces protein synthesis, then you get muscle loss, okay? So this might seem counterintuitive, but the breakdown of proteins becomes necessary to the synthesis of proteins, okay? So this is also necessary for the adaptation process. So how this works is you get protein from your diet, but you also are getting protein from your body just from turnover. All right, your body is constantly turning over cells and things in your body. So we are always breaking down protein and putting more protein in, breaking down protein, putting more protein in. So what your body is doing is when you exercise, you are damaging proteins. We need to break those down because we don't want the damaged proteins, right? We need to break those down, but we're not going to waste anything. We're going to take those proteins that we've broken down, those damaged ones, and those are going to go into a pool of amino acids. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So if my Lego castle is a protein, my Legos are the amino acids, okay? So I have protein Legos. I've just taken from this, this crappy Lego castle over here. I'm taking Legos from that and I'm gonna go build this nicer castle over here. All right, I'm pulling my resources from the Legos, and stupid analogy, but that's what's happening. I'm breaking down the damaged protein, I'm recycling those amino acids, and I'm building up and repairing, okay? So it's not like you're breaking down that protein and it's just gone, all right? So there's actually research that shows that a lack of cortisol in exercise it ruins exercise. Essentially, these rats, their adrenal gland was removed so that they weren't producing cortisol, and they fatigued sooner. They weren't able to hit intensities. So it was not good. So you do need cortisol during exercise to actually exercise. Part of that is what we call substrate utilization. Your muscles are using fuel. Substrates are what provides that fuel. So substrates are forms of protein, carbs, and fat. That's where calories come from. That's where energy comes from, is those three things. We take those large molecules, so protein, carbs, and fats, those are the large molecules, we break them down. Okay, so glucose is a substrate that comes from carbohydrate. Amino acids are substrates that come from protein. Okay, so substrate utilization. We are using those substrates. So we need to break those things down in order to use them. So we need cortisol. It has a purpose. Okay. We also find that cortisol may not break down muscles as much during exercise as it might when exercise is not occurring. So if you have a cortisol response when you're not exercising, that might actually be breaking down muscle. But cortisol responses during exercise aren't likely to be breaking down muscle as much. There's a study that shows that the effect of cortisol on muscle tissue specifically may be blunted during exercise because of the contractile activity. So there's things that are happening when your muscles are contracting that is making cortisol less likely to impact it. So hormones have to have a receptor to kind of launch into to exert their effects. Cortisol and testosterone have similar receptors, or at least this is what this research said, is that they might be, during exercise, they might be using a similar receptor or the same receptor, or cortisol receptors become less available during exercise. Whatever the reason is, testosterone and cortisol seem to be competing for receptors on that muscle cell. So the cortisol, even though it's high, it can't do anything to that muscle because it's not launching in, okay? It's not clicking. So you might not have to be as concerned about the muscle cell, or at least the working muscle cell, as you might think. Now, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, well, if I'm only working quads, and that's the only contractile activity that's occurring, then any other muscle in my body that isn't experiencing that contractile activity might not be as protected from cortisol. But maybe I'm okay with that because I'm breaking down my quad. I'm not breaking down my hamstring. My quad needs the extra amino acids. My hamstring doesn't right now. My hamstring can wait for that next meal. I'm not breaking it down. It has a normal tissue turnover rate right now, but I am turning over my quad more so. My quad needs the amino acids. So maybe I'm okay with cortisol going and taking amino acids from my hamstring right now so that it can give it to my quad so that I can go recover. Okay, maybe that's kind of the thought process you have to think about, is we're moving resources around the body, right? From where we don't need it to where we need it. And cortisol is essentially just a means of that. It's sending that signal of we need things, okay? So hopefully that makes more sense about cortisol. In summary, I don't think there's any reason to worry about cortisol response to exercise. I did also look for this study so that I'd be prepared to cite it if anyone asked me about it, but I couldn't find it again. I looked at this maybe a year ago as well, and there was some research that showed that the ability to increase cortisol during exercise actually makes you more resilient to stress, so that any increase in cortisol, your body is actually better, it can handle it better. So whether it's exercise stress or non-exercise stress, so any other stressor, like the IRS. So it makes you more resilient. Even if it's not exercise related, the exercise itself can make you more resilient to stress. But okay, that's everything I have on cortisol. I hope that was useful.